So when I was at Bible college, I did a paper on how to prepare a sermon. And you can tell me later on if you think I was paying attention or not. And one of the pieces of advice that they gave was to start with a story or a joke or something to break the ice. This isn't that story. This is just setting you up for the story that's coming a little bit later. I just wanted to build a little bit of suspense. Because the thing with Ezekiel is we're finishing up our series today. And the chapters that we're looking at have got some sermon illustrations ready-made and ready to go. And one of them, because I got to plan how the Ezekiel sermon series was going to play out. And I thought I'd done it so that Shannon was going to preach today because of this awesome sermon illustration that you're about to hear. But I'm not very good at maths, so you get it from me. But it's an absolute cracker of a sermon illustration. It'll be one that you remember for the rest of your life, I'm sure. So well done, everyone, on making it through 5 weeks of Ezekiel. This is our final sermon in the series. We had a week off last week, so I just wanted to give a bit of a recap of the journey that we've been on so far. And then I just wanted to focus today especially on some of the big themes of Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks a lot about sin, but Ezekiel also talks about hope. And Ezekiel talks about God's solution for sin and how God looks to solve that problem. Ezekiel, as we've discovered, it's a weird, and today is especially weird, hence I was trying to get Shannon to preach on it. It's not the easiest book to read. There's all these visions and dreams, and it's pretty graphic at times, and it's pretty intense. But it's a message of hope. It's a book full of hope, and it's a book that ultimately points to Jesus. So Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, it's a series of visions that Ezekiel the priest has, Ezekiel the prophet. And these visions, there's about 10 of them, depending on how you count them, and they take place over a period of about 20 years. And the first one, which we touched on a couple of weeks ago, God's people are in exile in Babylon. And Babylon was this dark hole. It was an absence of God, and they're there, and they're in exile, and we find out that the reason why they are there is because of sin. They have sinned repeatedly, and despite warning after warning after warning, the consequences of all this sin is that God is in the process of abandoning Jerusalem, and he's in the process of abandoning his temple. And if you keep reading through the book of Ezekiel, in chapter 24, Ezekiel gets word from some of his countrymen that this destruction has finally happened. The temple has been torn down to the ground and there's nothing left. Shannon showed us a couple of weeks ago, he talked about sin. And he talked about how there's a couple of different ways of thinking about sin. And one of these is this. Sin is a rejection of God's authority. And that's exactly what Israel had done. They had rejected God's authority and they had rejected God. And so God essentially said to them, look, if you don't want me here, I'll leave. And he left. We talked about how Israel trusted in their religious systems to get them right with God, to sort out their sin, to make sure they were being good people. And they trusted in the king. You know, one of King David's descendants was on the throne, and there had been descendants of King David on the throne for centuries. But the problems with the kings is that often they were corrupt, and they led people astray from God, so they couldn't trust in the kings. They also trusted in the temple system. And specifically, they trusted in offerings and sacrifices. But we read in the book of Isaiah, which was written at about the same time as Ezekiel, God says to them, and you can sense the anger in his voice almost. He says, I am sick of your burnt offerings. Stop bringing me your meaningless gifts. The incense of them disgusts me. So the temple system wasn't working for them either. They also trusted in the law. We're good people. We are moral people. We know the law. We study the law. We keep the law. But throughout the Old Testament, we read that God says to them, you're not as good as you think you are. You're not as moral as what you think you are and what you say you are. And a quick little side note there. If you put your trust in being a good person, it's going to let you down. So Israel, they had the king, they had the temple, they had the law, but none of these solved sin. None of them were helping them with their relationship with God. And the result was the separation from God. And Shannon, again, he talked about how sin robs us of community with God and sin robs us of community with each other. And for the people of Israel, this literally happened. They were separated from God. They were in Babylon. They were in exile. And it was while they were there in exile that they sang songs of lament. And one of them I tried to sing a couple of weeks ago, and I won't put you through that torment again. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And yet, and Gary reminded us of this, that even though they were in exile, and even though they were in judgment, and even though they had felt abandoned by God, God was still speaking hope to them, and He was still speaking messages of love over them, because they were His people, they were His children, and He loved them. Despite their rebellion and despite their rejection, God was not done with them yet. No matter what you've done, no matter what the things that I do, no matter how far we feel from God, no matter how far you feel from God, God is never done with you. God is always speaking messages of hope and love over us, and this was true for the people of Ezekiel, and it's true for us today. The Bible is a message of hope. God is never done with us. So the whole book of Ezekiel, it's a series of visions, and depending on how you count them, there's 10 in total. And this series, this last 5 weeks, we're just looking at the first vision that Ezekiel has. And that runs roughly through chapters 1 to 7. And we've covered the first 3 chapters, so we're going to race through the last 4 chapters, and this is where the sermon illustrations get kind of fun, right? There are some instructions that God gives to Ezekiel to try and get this message across about the judgment that is coming and the judgment that was happening. And I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, the finer details of these instructions, because again, with this whole series that we've been doing on Ezekiel, we've been looking at the bigger themes: sin, hope, God's faithfulness, I got that right, didn't I? I thought it said faithlessness for a second. God's faithfulness, all of that. That's what we're focusing on. But very briefly, in chapters 4 through to 7, Ezekiel, every day he stands in front of his fellow countrymen, in front of the exiles, and he starts talking to them about what is happening in Jerusalem and what is about to happen. And God gives him some pretty wild sermon illustrations. The first one that he gives is Ezekiel builds a clay model of Jerusalem and of the temple. And then he pulls out a frying pan, like an iron frying pan. And he says this frying pan represents Babylon. So it's made out of iron. It was the strongest metal known at the time. And clay is not that strong in comparison. And so this was getting the idea across that Israel was about to get bashed by Babylon. Every day for over a year, Ezekiel comes out in front of his countrymen and he ties himself up and he lies down on his side. And he lays there all day. And this was a picture of Israel being bound by Babylon, by being bound by sin. Ezekiel was a priest. And for the priests, they had this rule that you were never allowed to cut your hair and you were never allowed to cut your beard. They just weren't allowed to. And one day Ezekiel stands up in front of everybody and he pulls out a razor, an old-style razor, and he cuts all of his hair off and he cuts his beard off. And then he gets the hair and the beard here and he scatters it to the wind. And this is an illustration for Jerusalem being scattered in exile. And here's the one that I thought I'd leave for Shannon. To show how disgusted God was with Israel and how disgusted he was with their sin. Ezekiel used to cook his lunch in front of everybody every day. And normally if you're going to cook your lunch, you do it over a fire made out of wood. God tells Ezekiel to make his fire out of human poo. And Ezekiel's all like, ooh, that's, God, please. But that's how graphic, this is like the most graphic illustration I think that Ezekiel uses to try to get across to his people, to God's people. This is how repulsive sin is. And this is the sin that you are doing. This is the sin that you are committing. You don't even know it. Ezekiel negotiates with God and says, not human poo. And God's all like, okay, cow poo, because that's so much better, right? In comparison, I'm never going to have another decent sermon illustration again in my life. The point of all these visions, the point of all these sermon illustrations was clear, right? Destruction was imminent. And destruction was happening in Jerusalem. And it was caused by sin. Israel had rejected God. And because of that, God's presence had left Jerusalem and it had left the temple. So that was the situation. So what's the solution? I think oftentimes, and I've heard this a lot in my times as a pastor, I've heard people say things like, I'm not good enough for God. You know, I keep trying with God, I keep trying, but I know that I'll never measure up. If you knew who I am and if you knew what I've done, you know, it's no wonder that God has turned his back on me. And so I think all too often we are aware of the solution, of the situation that we're in. But then the solution often looks like this. Just try harder. Maybe sing a little bit louder. Be more moral. Stop sinning. Just be a better Christian. It will solve all your problems. And everyone's all like, oh, of course, that's what I'm doing wrong, right? And that was Israel's conclusion too. 70 years after they went into exile, some of the exiles were allowed to return to Jerusalem, and they started to rebuild the temple. And they started talking amongst themselves, hey, last time we had a temple, we dropped the ball. So this time we're going to try even harder. We're going to be even more faithful. We're going to be even more moral, more rules, more effort. That's how we will show that we are God's people. And over time, the religious leaders of Israel, they came up with a newer, better religious system. And they developed 613 rules that God's people had to follow. That's a lot of rules. But here's the problem with 613 rules, is that no one knew them all, no one understood them all, and no one could keep them. And doesn't being a Christian sometimes feel a little bit like that? Like there are 613 rules that you need to follow to be the perfect Christian, and if you break rule number 473, then you're a terrible person. I pulled number 473 out of random, and then I looked it up this morning. Law 473 is, depending on what version you're reading, is don't kidnap people, which is actually pretty good advice. It's pretty solid. If you're thinking to yourself, maybe I'm going to kidnap someone today, rule 473, don't do that. Okay, so there is some good things about the law. You know, the law was supposed to be about how do we relate to God, how do we relate to each other, how do we relate to ourselves. But the law became this weapon. It became a burden. Centuries later, in Jesus' time, there were a group of legal experts whose job it was to teach the law, to enforce the law, and they could dish out punishment depending on if you broke the law. So they're about consequences. And these people were called the Pharisees. And they took this duty seriously. For the Pharisees, the way that you knew if you belonged to God was you would know what rule number 473 was, but you'd know the other 612 as well. And they taught and they showed that if you wanted to be in the right place with God, you had to keep every single rule, and you had to know all the rules. But all they did was that they reduced faith to a bunch of boxes that you had to tick. Faith was reduced to rule keeping, and there was no life in it. It did probably help cut back on the number of kidnappings, just to be clear, so it wasn't all bad. But Jesus, he had a lot to say about the Pharisees, and most of it wasn't good. In Matthew 23, Jesus talked about how the Pharisees were crushing people with the law, with their religious demands that no one could bear. Jesus talked about how the Pharisees, they looked really good on the outside. He said they looked beautiful on the outside, but on the inside the Pharisees were dead. Whitewashed tombs, he called them. Pretty on the outside, but full of dead bones on the in. The system, the religious system that the Pharisees created, that they told people to trust in, was just making things worse. It didn't solve the problem of sin. The temple system, the law, morality, rule keeping, trying really, really hard, singing really loud in church, it wasn't working. It was crushing people. None of these could solve the sin problem. So what would? Let's go back to Ezekiel, because the answer starts there and then it finishes with Jesus. So amidst all the weirdness of Ezekiel and the poo, Ezekiel has these series of visions, and they're incredible, and they're wonderful, and they're full of hope. Emily helped me print off my sermon notes, and she put them in backwards, so we'll see how this goes. So he has all these visions. I'm going to go backwards and forwards. And the first one, and this is probably the most famous vision in the book of Ezekiel, it's from chapter 37. And Ezekiel has this vision of this valley, this massive valley, and it's filled with dry bones. They're dead and they're lifeless. And Ezekiel speaks to the bones. And, I mean, picture this in your head, and the bones all start kind of moving, and they start turning into skeletons. And then they get covered with muscle and with flesh and with skin, but they're still dead. And God says to Ezekiel, these bones are Israel. These bones are Israel in exile, dead and without hope. And then this is beautiful, because God starts speaking to the bones, and he says, my people, I will open your graves and cause you to rise again. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live again and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. The only solution for bringing dead things back to life is the Spirit of God. Chapter 36, the chapter before, Ezekiel 36. God is talking about people who had dead hearts inside of them. Hearts of stone, he calls them. And God says this, I will give you a new heart. I will put a new spirit in you. I will take out your stony, stubborn hearts and give you a tender, responsive heart. And I will put my spirit in you so that you will follow my decrees and be careful to obey my commands. The solution to sin is not following more rules. The solution to sin is a new heart which only comes from God. Chapter 47 of Ezekiel. In Israel, there is a sea called the Dead Sea. And it's not a very imaginative name because nothing lives in it because everything is dead. It's surrounded by desert. And so everything around the Dead Sea is dead too. It's not called the Dead Desert, although that would make sense. Starting in chapter 40 of Ezekiel, Ezekiel has this series of visions about a new temple. And the description of the temple takes 8 chapters because this temple is amazing. And this is the temple that will replace the temple, that will ultimately replace the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. And Ezekiel says that this temple is massive, and it is overflowing with the presence of the living God. And out of this temple, out of the presence of the living God, flows a river of living water. And this river, it flows from Jerusalem, from the temple, and it goes down to the Dead Sea. And as it flows towards what is dead, and as it flows through what is dead, it brings dead things to life. Where there was once death and barrenness, the rivers of living water flowing from the temple, where the presence of the living God lives, brings healing and renewal, transformation, and life. The solution to death starts with being in the presence of God. So Ezekiel, he starts us on this journey to finding a solution to the problem of sin, but the ultimate solution finishes with Jesus Christ. And in the New Testament, all the dots that are in Ezekiel and in other places throughout the Old Testament, the New Testament starts to connect all these dots. In John chapter 2, Jesus is standing in front of a new temple, and it's big and it's shiny and it's very pretty, but it's made out of stone, and it's a symbol of rules. The only way you could enter into the temple was if you knew the rules and if you kept the rules. It was for good people. But Jesus, he looks at this temple and he says, you know what? Actually, I am the new temple. And with this temple, in this temple, all people are welcome. In Christ Jesus, we encounter the presence of God. We don't encounter the presence of God and slavishly holding to rules and to trying to be a good person. We encounter God through his son, Jesus Christ. In John chapter 4, Jesus is having a discussion with the Samaritan woman, and they start talking about religious systems, about what rules to follow and whose rules are right. And she says to Jesus, as a Jewish man, you Jews say your religious system will save you. But we know that Samaritans, we know that our system, the Samaritan rules, the Samaritan religious system, that is the system that will save you. And the irony was this Samaritan woman had been divorced 5 times, had been remarried 5 times, was in an adulterous relationship, was a complete train wreck, was a complete mess, and she was outside both set of rules. So she was talking about which rules will save you, and she was breaking all of them. She was not a good person. She was not a moral person. She was broken on the margins of society and failing at both religious systems, because religious systems do not save you. And what does Jesus say to this woman? What does he say to all of us? He says religion will not save you. Only drinking from the living water will save you. And then he says to her, and he says to all of us, I am the one you are looking for. Despite who she was and what she'd done and everything that she'd done, and Jesus knew what she'd done, and he knew who she was, he says to her, and he says to all of us, I am the one you are looking for. Dry bones coming to life by the Spirit of God. Stony hearts being transformed by God's Spirit. Dead seas and dead deserts being brought to life by the river of God. And all of this fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the new temple, the living water. Religion cannot save you. Rule keeping cannot save you. Being a good person cannot save you. The only thing that brings life is an encounter with the living Christ. No matter how far you run, no matter how broken you are, no matter how thirsty you are, God has not turned his back on you. God is not done with you. Christ himself says, I am the one you're looking for. The Spirit is still alive, is still breathing life into dry bones. The river is still flowing. The temple has come and his name is Jesus. And the invitation is simple. Come to him. Receive his Spirit. Let his living water flow into the broken, dark, dry places of your life. One of the beautiful things about church, not just this church, but every church that believes in the Lord Jesus Christ, is that Christ is present here today. And if you want to have an experience of Jesus Christ, maybe for the first time, maybe for the millionth time, Christ is present here today and he wants to meet with you. So whether it's that you need a drink of the living water for the first time or the 100th time because you're just really, really thirsty and you've been trying really hard and you've been trying to do all the right things, Christ is here today. Wasn't quite sure where we would go at the end of you might have noticed we didn't have open space this morning. And so we're going to have some kind of open space now, and I'm not quite sure what it's going to look like. But if Christ is speaking to you this morning, this is an invitation for you. We have a whole bunch of lovely people who would love to pray with you. If you would like to, I'd like to challenge you to come up the front. If you would like prayer, I would like to challenge you to come up the front. But if you are shy, the wonderful thing about this place is you can just tap the shoulder of someone sitting next to you, and they would love to pray for you as well.